The Chamber, by majority, hereby decides that the prosecutor has failed to satisfy the burden of proof to the requisite standard as foreseen in Article 66 of the Rome Statute. Grants the defense motions for acquittal from all charges against Mr. Laurent Gbagbo and Mr. Charles Blé. Orders the immediate release of both accused.
And that marked the end of former Ivory Coast President Laurent Gbagbo's 7 years as a criminal at the International Criminal Court. An appeal to stop his release failed on Wednesday. He's now on his way to freedom and who knows, maybe even to contest the 2020 elections. Tonight we look at what lies ahead for Ivory Coast should one of the country's strongmen return home. Editor of the Justice Tribune, Janet Anderson, joins me on Skype from The Hague to give us the latest developments from the ICC. Foreign correspondent Leanne Dupont will join us later from the Ivorian capital. And here in the studio I'm with Professor Mia Swart from the Human Science Research Council and Africa analyst Isaac Komo. Good to have you all with us. Thanks for joining us to talk about this. Janet, let me start off with you. What went wrong?
Nobody's entirely sure exactly what went wrong, but it looks as if the prosecutor didn't manage to collect exactly the right kind of evidence. It looks as if they didn't manage to make the linkage between the people who were on trial, the accused, and what actually happened on the ground, because we know that some very serious things happened on the ground in Ivory Coast at that time during the post-election violence. They didn't manage to prove that Gbagbo and Blé, his right-hand man, were actually responsible.
I should imagine that people are stunned about this.
Well, stunned, yes, this was the biggest fish that the ICC had. You have a former president on trial. You kind of assume that they've managed to do exactly the right kind of work, collect exactly the right kind of evidence in order to be able to prove their case. So everybody's searching around for answers. But you also have to put this in the context that just recently the former vice president of the Democratic Republic of Congo was also found not guilty, and that previously the presidents and vice presidents of Kenya, their trials failed at the ICC. So it's starting to look like a little bit of a pattern.
It really is. I mean, what sort of impact, what sort of damage will this have on the ICC? I mean, considering that so many African leaders feel that they've been unfairly targeted.
I think that the reputation of the ICC is in shreds, in tatters at the moment. Yes, there's been a huge amount of criticism that the ICC was only targeting Africans. In fact, many of the cases that were brought there were actually referred by African countries themselves, Ivory Coast included. So maybe some of that criticism was less than fair, and beyond that, they have moved beyond Africa and are now looking into Georgia, Afghanistan, Palestine. Some are only in the initial stages, but some are meant to go fully to trial. But in general, it looks as if the main engine of the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor, the people who are responsible for collecting all of the evidence, we're now in our second prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, from Africa herself, from the Gambia. And by the end of her tenure, there'll only be a handful of convictions from a court that's been going then for 18 years by the time she leaves.
An extraordinary amount of money too. Where does this leave justice then?
We have developments such as a new special court coming in the Central African Republic. We've had the trial of Hissène Habré from Chad. A special court was put together with the backing of the African Union in Senegal. So maybe we should be looking at more local solutions, more local ways of tackling justice.
All right, thank you very much for that, Janet Anderson. Leanne, tell us about the feeling there at home, the fact that Gbagbo could be returning soon. Right, okay, I don't think Leanne can hear me. Professor Meerswart, what do you think went wrong?
Well, I think it's very important to say that this is not the error of Fatou Bensouda. This is really her predecessor, Ocampo, who should never have charged under Article 25. He should never have charged under common purpose, you know. So I think, first of all, you know, it is not the job of the court to necessarily convict. I think that needs to be made clear, you know. There's something such as the presumption of innocence, and it's the court's job to find evidence and to charge correctly, right? So I think, first of all, you know, in this respect, I think Fatou Bensouda is off the hook. It was really brought, those 4 crimes against humanity charges, by her predecessor, Moreno Ocampo, who was very controversial. So first of all, I think that it is a problem that there's been so few convictions, but one has to be careful about the way one speaks about this, because one cannot necessarily measure success according to the number of convictions, right? This court is very well resourced. There is really, you know, it's been about 3 years they had, many thousands of documents to produce the correct kind of evidence, and they failed. It's similar to the Kenyan case against Uhuru Kenyatta, where again, you know, in this case...
You wonder how they can fail. I mean, you've got the best resources, I should imagine.
Okay, so I think there's another tricky question here, which is that you have many thousands of victims. But it doesn't follow, you know, that you can that you can trace criminal guilt to a particular individual just because you had that amount of victims. And the counsel for the victims was speaking on international news channels, Al Jazeera, etc., yesterday, Paulina Masara, and she was saying, you know, this is a deception, etc. But at the same time, the lawyer's job is still to find criminal guilt according to a particular section of the Rome Statute. And the prosecution has failed dismally to do this, right? And he should never have been charged. So there is a possibility he's innocent. You see, it doesn't flow from the fact that there is that amount of victims that he was responsible for the post-election violence. Yes.
Isaac, how are you reading this? Is this the right end?
From the professor, first of all, I totally agree with her. You know, in fact, also I was shocked when you say that what went wrong. You know, you mean to say that people expecting the man was guilty as charged? That's very dangerous.
Talking more about what went wrong.
But I'll come to you. But you see, the very important thing is this, that basically, let's talk about the case. With the case, all the witnesses who have been following it, because it was live on their website, all the witnesses who were taken there by the prosecution, under cross-examination, they contradicted themselves. And some actually sort of said that that's not their statement, that's what they were told to say. So at the end of the day, that case actually did collapse. That's the thing that people do not know. That's why when the prosecution finished its case, and it was a time for the defense, the prosecution wanted to bring in more witnesses. They said, no, it's too late. And also, to make things worse, when Gbagbo was taken to the ICC, he was not taken by the Ivorians, he was taken by France. And France actually gave money to Ocampo to start charging him. That's the thing that people do not know. It was a French thing.
And why would they want to do that?
Okay, that's why we say that in this case it was the ICC which was under trial. Yeah, but when they got there, when they first brought in the charges, the judges says there's not much in here. You can't charge the man with these charges. So they had to go back.
An incredibly long time, isn't it?
No, but they had to go back to get more charges. And the second time they failed again. It was on the third attempt.
Okay, let's go over to Leanne. I believe you can hear me now. Leanne, I'm just wondering how this news is being absorbed back at home.
Well, the opinions are mixed, Jane. Of course, you have victims associations, groups that are not happy. They've been protesting all week. Came to the fore in Abobo, which is one of the popular neighborhoods in Abidjan, on Wednesday when news came that he would be released immediately. Of course, we know that decision has now been put on ice. But people have been both very, very upset about it, but also very excited hinted at the possibility that Gbagbo would be coming back to Ivory Coast, getting involved in Ivorian politics once again, and of course this before a very crucial presidential election in 2020.
So that's assuming that many people feel that he's been wronged. I mean, what was his popularity before he went off to The Hague?
He's a hugely popular former president. Of course, he served 2 terms, and if he were to come back and use the same reasoning that the incumbent president, Alassane Ouattara, who said that he is allowed to go for a 3rd mandate because of constitutional reforms that reset the clocks in 2016. So Gbagbo could use the same reasoning to do that. Of course, his party is fragmented. While he's been in The Hague, the party is split between loyalists to Gbagbo and those that have tried to remain within the political system, trying to still go through elections. They didn't fare very well at the local government elections that took place in October. But with Simone Gbagbo, his wife, out of the local prison here, with Gbagbo possibly coming back, they could regroup and perhaps even look at a coalition with Ouattara, who's the incumbent president's former coalition partner, who also just split a couple of months ago.
Isaac, do you think this could be good for politics?
Well, I think it is good for politics because actually it takes the politics of the African continent at a higher level. Yeah, I mean to say that the most important thing is this, that the whole thing about Gbagbo, there's this external interference. It's like the DRC case. In the DRC, there's loss of credibility of the elections, and also there's interference. But people don't talk about the initial interference. The initial interference was by the West. How can the West go and call Congolese politicians to Brussels? That's by the EU. And then hold them incognito and try to make them come up with a single partner. Americans won't agree to that. Yeah, and it happened about 3 times. Eventually, they came up with this other, with Fayulu. I'm not taking sides, but I'm just saying that the external interference. So now we have come to a point where when you talk of interference, it's not only internal, it's external. Yeah, so that's a very important thing that people don't look. The Congolese elections, the way they were actually put aside, it is because of this Western interference.
Okay, so this is a man possibly wronged. I mean, we don't know this yet, but where does this leave justice? I mean, for all of those victims, where do they get, and their families, where do they get closure now?
Right, so I have to make 2 points. The one is that there is a strong belief on the behalf of people who are very close to this case that the charges against Gbagbo were manufactured, that Ocampo looked at certain speeches that were made by him and his co-accused and inferred from that Gbagbo was saying, we will win this election at any cost, even if we have to kill civilians. And this was never proven. And it suits the current leader, Ouattara, very well that Gbagbo is in The Hague, because Ouattara was accused of crimes himself. And I cannot overemphasize this point that however many victims you have and however atrocious those crimes might have been, there is no logical connection between those atrocities and the guilt, the criminal legal guilt of one person. So you cannot automatically jump to this conclusion, oh, it's a farce, it's a deception. This is all overly dramatic. Those judges are very responsible and, they know the law. So, I think that this is not a failure on the part of the ICC. One has to also distinguish between judges and the prosecution. We know there's a trust fund for victims at the ICC, so there is a possibility that the victims will get compensation in the form of assistance. Reparations only flow from criminal guilt, which is a tricky thing at the ICC, that one necessarily has to have a conviction before you can pay reparations. But they have the discretion to pay assistance to the victims. But of course, in a case where you have so many victims, it is very difficult to find enough money for that. But we'll see what happens on appeal. This case is going on appeal now, and it's not entirely inconceivable that there could be a conviction in the end, but I find it highly unlikely. It is also very unusual for a case that, for an acquittal on the trial level to go to conviction on the appeals level. And then in terms of the pretrial detention, which you mentioned, And you also used the word justice. You know, there is no justice, I believe, in keeping someone in detention for 6-7 years before they, I think
part of his life destroyed. I mean, Leanne, what about those who have had their lives destroyed? And Janet raised quite a popular concept of justice at home, rather. Should people get involved? Should this be pushed up another level in the Ivory Coast in order to get to the bottom of what happened?
Well, there is a big push to do that here, Jane. Of course, when the government eventually released their statement on news of Gbagbo's acquittal, they were saying that they hope that this decision builds on the reconciliation and the peace that Ouattara has tried to bring. So it seems like that conversation is starting. Of course, last August, following the Independence Day presidential pardons that he gave, which included Simone Gbagbo's wife and thousands of other political prisoners, that was the start of this reconciliation and peace that Ouattara was trying to bring ahead of the 2020 election. Civil society organizations largely welcomed it, but a lot of international organizations were saying that still doesn't bring justice to the victims that were perpetrated against. And so it does remain a big question, both here in Ivory Coast and in The Hague and elsewhere. What will actually happen now? Are they going to start a conversation, or are they just going to brush it aside, bury the hatchet, and move on towards the elections next year?
And Isaac, with France on the United Nations Security Council, we've got South Africa's presence there. Are we going to see any changes, do you think? I mean, what sort of impact will it have on the UN? Are they likely to take any sort of action?
Well, the UN, I think they cannot do much, because basically the Security Council, they put their trust on the ICC. Yeah. It's not a case, the time where the Security Council could actually intervene, it's long gone. So basically, it's a gone case. But I'm surprised that people want to get the men back onto the thing there. But
what about the African Union? I mean, what?
Yeah, but let's talk about something. The funny thing about justice is this: that unfortunately, the post-election violence was not started by the Gbagbo forces. They were started by Ouattara forces under Guam Saro, the prime minister. And over 70% of the atrocities were perpetrated by the Ouattara forces. But there is no commander of the Ouattara forces was taken to the ICC. Those are findings of commission, an internal commission. And again, with justice, it could have actually taken place with an internally sort of initiated peace and reconciliation, which the government actually sort of dodged its way, trying to show that Gbagbo is a perpetrator of everything else.
It's a real failure of the international legal system there, isn't it? Right. I mean, where do you think this leaves the country now? I mean, are we looking at better times there?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely, because we know there's an election coming up next year, and it seems like it's not in the interest of the powers that be that Gbagbo be, part of the electoral context, right? Yes, and he's really in a pickle now. He'll probably it will be very difficult to go home with this, conviction of embezzlement against him there. There's an ongoing criminal case against him as well. And, there's a number of European countries that's being approached on his behalf to take him, but it doesn't look like there's any takers at this point. So he's really now in an incredible predicament. And I think that the ICC should take some blame for this at this point. We know that this kind of justice is always politicized, but this case really highlights just how political it can become, and how much power the prosecutor has. So I think that this actually reflects incredibly badly on the ICC, but not because he wasn't convicted, because of all the politics around the case. I think that's the problem.
And branching out, going back to Ivory Coast's neighbours, I mean, what sort of role will they have going forward, and what are their interests? Yeah,
that's the Mano Basin area. The Mano Basin area, they actually want peace to actually sort of percolate throughout the area, be it Ghana, be it the neighboring countries, Liberia. So basically, they just hope that let the democratic process go. And I think that Thabo Mbeki said it. He has said it many times, and Thabo Mbeki knows the case very well. he actually warned. He says that taking Gbagbo to the ICC was a mistake because the charges and they're not supposed to be there. But he says that bodes bad for peace in Ivory Coast and also in the region. But that's what it is. Funny enough, Gbagbo's got a very strong support.
And healing those divisions in the country, Leanne touched on it briefly, but what do you think needs to be done? Healing the divisions and the pain?
Well, what needed to happen was this an internally generated peace and reconciliation movement, which was not there. The government
Why did that not happen?
Ouattara's got to answer that. But I mean to say the mere fact that they actually went, okay, Gbagbo was taken to the ICC by France. Ouattara supported it. And the next thing they did, they took his wife, Dr. Simone. Gbagbo's got a brilliant wife. She's a PhD. Yeah, in fact, she was the brains behind the whole thing. They went and they took her to court, and they found her guilty for court cases which were really sort of spurred on cases. But they had to release her. But now that doesn't bode well for peace and reconciliation. They try to destroy the whole opposition. Now you don't do that with peace and reconciliation. That's where Ouattara actually got it wrong.
If I may add to that,
yes.
I think one way in which to kickstart some sort of peace process could be for the international community to intervene in the right way. It's a very tricky sort of task, but I think that internally, if there is no momentum to reconcile and there is absolutely no process and no political will to get this started, the international community could intervene, the AU could intervene. But first of all, I think that...
Yes, how do you suggest they'd intervene, though?
Well, we saw that in the Gambia there was some pressure by the AU for political change. That was actually quite successful. So I wouldn't give up on the AU as a strong force in African politics. The United Nations can assist in creating a truth commission. This has happened in some contexts. It's not ideal. It should be homegrown. That is always the best. It's always more legitimate, and it works better. But I think that at this point, to prevent further bloodshed or further violence, because we're seeing another election coming up, and there might be post-election violence as well. And this applies, in my mind, to the Congo as well. That you can have good international intervention if it's well considered and it fits the context.
I'd love to get your response, but we've run out of time. Isaac, who has been shaking his head.
I'll just say one thing. There is the France-Afrique. France will never allow it.
Okay, let's leave it there. Isaac Omo and Mioswat, thank you. Up next, a detailed look at the war in Syria and its implications.